Welcome to episode 96 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I am your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first line-by-line review of the poem, and we have temporarily turned to the presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's On Ends. Today we continue with that material, starting with section 12. Now let's join our panel for today's discussion with Joshua and Don reading today's text.
Again, the truth that pleasure is the supreme good can be most easily apprehended from the following consideration. Let us imagine an individual in the enjoyment of pleasures great, numerous, and constant, both mental and bodily, with no pain to thwart or threaten them. I ask, what circumstances can we describe as more excellent than these, or more desirable? A man whose circumstances are such must needs possess, as well as other things, a robust mind, subject to no fear of death or pain, because death is apart from sensation, and pain, when lasting, is usually slight, when oppressive is of short duration, so that its temporariness reconciles us to its intensity, and its slightness to its continuance. When, in addition, we suppose that such a man is in no awe of the influence of the gods, and does not allow his past pleasures to slip away, but takes delight in constantly recalling them, what circumstance is it possible to add to these to make his condition better? Imagine, on the other hand, a man worn by the greatest mentally and bodily pains which can befall a human being, with no hope before him that his lot will ever be lighter, and, moreover, destitute of pleasure, either actual or probable. What more pitiable object can be mentioned or imagined? But if a life replete with pains is above all things to be shunned, then assuredly the supreme evil is life accompanied by pain. And from this view, it is a constant inference that the climax of things good is life accompanied by pleasure. Nor indeed can our mind find any other ground whereon to take its stand, as though already at the goal. And all its fears and sorrows are comprised under the term pain. Nor is there any other thing beside which is able merely by its own character to cause us vexation or pangs. In addition to this, the germs of desire and aversion, and generally of action, originate either in pleasure or in pain. This being so, it is plain that all right and praiseworthy action has the life of pleasure for its aim. Now, inasmuch as the climax or goal or limit of things good, which the Greeks term telos, is that object which is not a means to the attainment of anything else, while all other things are a means to its attainment, we must allow that the climax of things good is to live agreeably.
Those who find this good in virtue and virtue only, and dazzled by the glory of her name, fail to perceive what it is that nature craves, will be emancipated from heresy of the deepest dye, if they will deign to lend ear to Epicurus. For unless your grand and beautiful virtues were productive of pleasure, who would suppose them to be either meritorious or desirable? Yes, just as we regard with favor the physician's skill not for his art's sake merely, but because we prize sound health, and just as the pilot's art is praised on utilitarian and not on artistic grounds, because it supplies the principles of good navigation, so wisdom, which we must hold to be the art of living, would be no object of desire if it were productive of no advantage. But it is in fact desired, because it is to us as an architect that plans and accomplishes pleasure. You are now aware what kind of pleasure I mean, so the odium of the term must not shake the foundation of my argument. For seeing that the life of men is most of all troubled by ignorance about the goodness and badness of things, and on account of this blindness men are often robbed of the intensest pleasures and also are racked by the severest mental pains, we must summon to our aid wisdom, that she may remove from us all alarms and passions, and stripping us of our heedless confidence in all false imaginations, may offer herself as our surest guide to pleasure. Wisdom, indeed, is alone able to drive sadness from our minds and to prevent us from quaking with fear, and if we sit at her feet, we may live in perfect calm when once the heat of every passion has been cooled. Verily, the passions are unconscionable and overthrow not merely individual men, but whole families, and often shake the foundations of the entire commonwealth. From passions spring enmities, divisions, strifes, rebellions, and wars. Nor do the passions only air their pride abroad, for they do not merely attack others than ourselves in their blind onset, but even when imprisoned within our own breasts, they are at variance and strife one with another. And the inevitable result of this life is of the bitterest kind, so that the wise man alone, who has cut back and pruned away all vanity and delusion, can live contentedly within the bounds prescribed by nature, emancipated from all sorrow and from all fear. I ask what classification is either more profitable or more suited to the life of happiness than that adopted by Epicurus. He affirmed that there is one class of passions which are both natural and needful, another class which are natural without being needful, a third class which are neither natural nor needful, and such are the conditions of these passions that the needful class are satisfied without much trouble or expenditure. Nor is it much that the natural passions crave, since nature herself makes such wealth as will satisfy her both easy of access and moderate in amount, and it is not possible to discover any boundary or limit to false passions. But if we see that all human life is agitated by confusion and ignorance, and that wisdom alone can redeem us from the violence of our lusts and from the menace of our fears, and alone can teach us to endure humbly even the outrages of fortune, and alone can guide us into every path which leads to peace and calm, why should we hesitate to say that wisdom is desirable in view of pleasures, and unwisdom to be shunned on account of annoyances?
Why should you hesitate? Because you'll be thrown out of every college and school and church in the United States and the world. That's why you should hesitate. And so you should be very clear about what you're saying. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Joshua, for reading that. There's so much in this section today, and hopefully we can get to all of it. But every time you read it, to me, reading can bring out things that you haven't even thought about before. Because what caught my eye when Don was finishing that section there is how the natural and necessary discussion is really, the word's not buried, but it's included within the discussion of wisdom. He starts off talking about wisdom, then he switches over to talking about natural and necessary classifications, and then he comes back to discussing wisdom again. So it should have been obvious to me a long time ago that this natural and necessary discussion is intimately tied to wisdom in general. But that's not the beginning of where we are today. We have to start back at the beginning. So today's text begins with section 12, approximately line 40, and starts with this illustration of the supreme good. Who would like to attack the illustration of the supreme good and show how it can be most easily apprehended from the following consideration?
I've just had an exciting couple of minutes. I realized there was a wasp trapped in my car with me.
Oh, no.
I think I got it out. I'm not sure.
Well, that's an example of a practical consideration coming before the discussion of the philosophy, for sure.
Yes, that is a perfect example of why mental anxiety is put on a level with physical pain as an evil thing.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah.
There is no way to imagine the best life to include sitting in a car with a wasp or a bee just buzzing around you, getting ready to strike at any moment.
Certainly not. No, certainly not. Okay, so your question, again, the truth that pleasure is the supreme good can be most easily apprehended from the following consideration. He goes into, in this paragraph, a description of two individuals. One of these individuals is in the enjoyment of pleasures great, numerous, and constant, both mental and bodily, with no pain to thwart or threaten him. Okay, here's what's interesting about this passage for me is we talked a lot in the last episode about two kinds of pleasure and, the highest good as being pleasure, which is equivalent to the absence of pain. What I particularly enjoy in this paragraph is this 3 or 4, maybe 5 words here, both mental and bodily.
Yes.
So what Torquatus is stating here right from the get-go in section 12 is that bodily pleasures, not merely mental pleasures, not only, freedom from anxiety, but bodily pleasures are also an embodiment of the good, which is pleasure itself, and worth pursuing in their own right. We would apply hedonic calculus to decide which ones to choose and which ones not to choose. But there's no sense that bodily pleasures are to be shunned. They are a respectable facet of the good life.
Amen. Well put.
Yeah. And let me say this before I forget as well. That assertion is so controversial. There are many articles that I've read in the past in studying up on Epicurus where commentators are out there asserting that this particular passage in Cicero is a total distortion and fabrication of Epicurean philosophy. They say that Cicero cannot be trusted. He is totally contradicting himself. He's contradicting Epicurus. It's just the worst passage in any Epicurean text that's out there, according to these commentators. Even from the first, when I was reading the Norman DeWitt material, there's an article he pointed to from someone named Packer Porter or something like that, who wrote about Cicero's presentation of Epicurean ethics. And there was that discussion in that article, and it occurs in other places because you pretty much have to take a position. Is this a correct statement of the Epicurean best life that we as human beings should strive towards? Or is this something that's absolutely inconsistent with the letter to Menicius and other things that you read in Epicurus about tranquility being the sole definition of the best life? And I think it's obvious where my flag is planted, because I believe that this is a correct statement here, because I think it makes sense. The only thing that makes sense consistent with the rest of the philosophy. But I do think this is an extremely controversial passage. The part about, like you said, great and numerous and constant mental and bodily enjoyment of pleasure is great. I think some of the other translations talked about intensity of pleasure or something like that. But there's just no getting around, as I understand the original Latin words here, that these are active pleasures that are being discussed here as part of the picture. Now, when you start talking both mental and bodily, I love that too, because it sweeps everything to me. I cannot imagine a type of pleasure that is neither mental nor bodily, frankly. Exactly. I don't know, maybe somebody else can. I think that description encompasses any type of pleasure that anybody could come up with. So there's just a bright line to draw here. But how do you relate this description to tranquility? I certainly don't reject tranquility. I would say tranquility is a part of it, which is, and in fact, it is the part of it where he says you possess a robust mind that is subject to no fear of death or pain, and you have no fear of the gods. You don't allow your past pleasures to slip away. You take delight in recalling them. You're imagining the individual with pleasures great, with no pain to thwart or threaten them. To me, that is the confidence that would be, in my mind, to some extent, both aponia and ataraxia described there as well. If you have no pain or threat of pain, I think that would eliminate both of those two terms.
I think I might have posted something about this on the forum too, that I think that the without fear of pain and that sort of thing, I think is a description of the condition, but I would include ataraxia and aponia as part of the mental pleasures that he's talking about that are great and numerous that you experience. So I think
you say you can feel them. You say you can feel ataraxia.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. That it's not. I think you brought up the term numbness. I think a lot of people seem to equate ataraxia with numbness, and I completely reject that characterization. Not necessarily from you, but I mean that other people, like it's like some sort of like state where you don't feel anything but it's not. I mean, I keep thinking of ataraxia as, like I said, I think I use the analogy, since we're big into analogies now, and we give it the imprimatur to analogies, you're outside on a warm summer day and you close your eyes and you're looking up at the sky and just feeling the warmth of the sun in your face and your cares have washed away. And that to me is a description of ataraxia.
When I was much younger in 1969 and I was watching those astronauts land in the Sea of Tranquility on the moon, it never occurred to me that I would develop a reputation being opposed to tranquility or anything like that, because I certainly agree that tranquility is the feeling that I experience as well when I'm happy, and in all sorts of ways to describe it. But I describe it as a feeling. I don't describe it as a numbness or an anesthesia. you.
Right.
And it's part of what my goal for life would be. I wish to be tranquil, but I also wish to do all sorts of other things in addition that I would not call as tranquil, like even the example of going to the moon. There's not a whole lot of tranquility in strapping a rocket to your back and going to do all that, but I would personally love to do something like that. I think it's a legitimate goal that an Epicurean would identify some very untranquil goal as something they want to do as part of their life. So,
well, you keep coming back. I keep coming back to that fragment, or I can't remember whether it's a fragment or a Vatican saying about, I cannot conceive of the good without the pleasing sights and pleasing tastes and pleasing this and pleasing that, and it just seems like, the people that are going to call this section of Cicero completely contrary to Epicurean philosophy and stuff don't take that particular fragment or even the sections of the letter to Menoikeus as he's talking about the same thing. I mean, there's multiple pleasures that you're going to take in your life, and the fact that people are trying to say that it's one thing is not. I just don't think there's support for that unless you can tie yourself into an academic pretzel.
Martin, to what extent do you identify this section 40 here as something that you can match to your own view of life?
Yeah, I mean, I see nothing different in there.
Nothing jumps out at you as a problem here.
Yes.
I suppose someone could argue that it's not necessary to give elaborate descriptions of things and just point to pleasure or point to kittens or puppies as examples of what the goal is. But I do see this list of characteristics here as probably one of the most clear that I've ever seen in any Epicurean text. And maybe that leads me to this transition here. Before we move on to the bad side of life, I think we ought to probably talk about the fact of what type of argument this is. I sometimes wonder whether he's appealing to, we don't talk about anticipations very much lately, but his argument here is really, and we discussed this the last couple of weeks too, it's not necessarily the kind of argument that is going to just bowl over everybody. He's submitting to us that if we think about a person in this state of pleasure and confidence and continuity and absence of pain and tranquility and all these other good things, he's setting up the argument as if, well, everybody's going to, of course, agree with that once we just put it forward and it's self-evident that everyone will agree. I don't think it is self-evident that everyone will agree, though. And so what do you guys think about that aspect of this? What's he appealing to as his ultimate standard of right and wrong of his position?
What this really is, Cassius, as you sort of implied, is a thought experiment. And I think you're right to say that after merely reading this passage, people who disagree with Epicurus or would think the pursuit of pleasure is not the proper end of life, they're not going to be convinced. And you'll find instances in the works of the antagonists of Epicurean philosophy, where they'll use their own thought experiments to portray pleasure as a bad thing, right? Imagine a person who just pursues pleasure and, their business is going into the toilet and their family relationships are destroyed. And it's easy to do. It's easy to think, a person heedlessly pursuing pleasure is going to be someone not just like a laughing stock, but almost immoral. It's immoral to put your own personal selfish pursuit of pleasure ahead of your duty to your country, to your fellow citizens, to your family, to your wife, whoever it is. Someone would do the same. They just simply arrange the thought experiment differently.
And they almost, whenever you brought that up, they almost set up a straw man in the idea of the pursuit of pleasure. They take that almost in the sense that Principal Doctrine 10 about that, we don't necessarily endorse the pleasures of the profligate. And he talks in the next section about, the wise choices and avoidances that you do. And the people that set up that, if the pursuit of pleasure is going to go down the wrong road and you're going to be in the, like you said, your life's going to go in the toilet and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's more of an argument, at least in my mind, against the Cyrenaics than it is the Epicureans, but they just lump the whole quote-unquote hedonist philosophies together and try and treat them as one monolithic thing. And that does a disservice to Epicurean philosophy, but of course it does a service to their opponents because it makes it easier to argue against.
Right. I don't know, Don, have you read A Few Days in Athens by Frances Wright?
I have not read the whole thing.
Gotcha. Okay. It doesn't really matter, but she does have a particular point in that book when Epicurus and Zeno sort of come head to head and they're arguing directly with each other, which is not how most of that book goes. And in that section or in that passage, Zeno has this interesting change of his understanding as it pertains to Epicurus. Prior to him meeting Epicurus face to face, he had believed all of the slanderous rumors about him, the heedless drunken orgies and all of that.
Yep.
And then he has this interesting quote. Granted, this is all totally fictional, but I think it's worth talking about.
Sure.
He has this interesting quote where he says, he's speaking to Epicurus. He says, "I feared you yesterday, because of, you're poisoning the minds of young Athenians with the pursuit of heedless, mindless pleasure." And then he says, "I fear you doubly today." What he says, now that I understand, the totality of your philosophy, I can see that this is even more of a problem than I thought it was, because you've wrapped it up in a way that is appealing to people who wouldn't normally be appealed to by mere hedonism, you might call it.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah. So, in other words, knowing what I know about valuing mental pleasures and avoiding the fear of death, this is going to cause even more problems than if you were just a Cyrenaic. It would be better if you were, it would be better for Athens if you were having drunken orgies every night,
Right?
Rather than sober, philosophical discourse on the pursuit of pleasure. So that is a kind of thought experiment in itself,
Right?
In which he is not really making the same straw man that you were just talking about. Again, with the caveat that this is a totally fictional argument. I'm wondering
which a thought experiment is, sort of. That whole book can be seen as a thought experiment in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. I like that. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Anyway, worth talking about. Cassius or Martin, does anybody have any response to that in particular?
Martin?
Fully agree. So far, I didn't hear anything or read anything controversial.
And I think that Martin's comment right there, I think, is my. I think before we started, I was saying about the self-evident nature of these things too, and I think that of course, Martin is a friendly ear to hear this, but I think that it really does set up sort of a common sense sort of thought experiment in this little passage here.
There's no way I'm letting you guys off so easily as to just say this is so basic that it doesn't need explanation, because Torquatus is saying that this illustration is the most easy way for us to apprehend the truth that pleasure is the supreme good. Maybe the way I'd like to focus on it would be to ask this question again: to what tribunal of truth is he appealing? To what standard of accuracy is he appealing? What type of person, what type of reasoning is going to agree with this illustration? I think we can all pretty well understand that a religious type is just going to throw it out because it doesn't talk about God. And a Platonic type is just going to throw it out because it doesn't talk about virtue or some kind of absolute truth in a realm of ideal forms. But I don't think that talking about those two categories really answers the question fully. What reasoning process or process of reaching a conclusion is he appealing to?
Okay, to answer that question, I'm going to talk about a third thought experiment. So we have read the section that has to do with sort of the ideal life, an individual in the enjoyment of pleasures great, numerous, and constant. He goes on later to describe a person who is just racked with physical pain and mental anguish, and that's considered to be sort of the ultimate undesirable state. You mentioned God a little bit ago. In the book of Job in the Bible, you have a figure who is renowned for his piety, and God has this sort of test where I can't really remember who he's talking to, but he says, I bet I could just totally...
the devil, I think.
I think you're probably right about that. Yeah. So this is a thought experiment. God talking to the devil, and the devil saying, well, yeah, of course Job is happy with, you and willing to worship you. He has everything. He has everything a man could want in this world. So it's easy for him to have all that and choose a blissful eternity in the next world. At which point God says, I'll take all that away from him and we'll see if he still worships me. And so he does. He destroys his wealth, ruins his property, kills his children and all this. And you get to this point where Job is the person described in this passage, where he's a man worn by the greatest mental and bodily pains which can befall a human being, with no hope before him that his lot will ever be lighter, and moreover destitute of pleasure either actual or probable. What more pitiable object can be mentioned or imagined? Cassius, you're absolutely right to say that a religious person reading this is going to dismiss that, because Job, of course, is a person that is revered by Christians and just by Christians, I guess.
Could be others too. I forget where he exists on that train of before the Islamics came along, so it could be them too.
It is in the Old Testament, isn't it?
Yes,
you're right. Yeah,
pretty
so
far back.
Anyway, we'll just stick with that. Religious people are going to admire and revere this figure for his patience in enduring the totalitarian instincts.
And his example of always just trusting God, that everything's going to work out in the end, that we don't understand God's ways, we don't understand why he does things, but we shouldn't understand them. He's God. We're the little worms on earth who are just at his feet. I remember the day I was in Sunday school long ago and first heard the story of the book of Job, and the teacher was talking about the different lessons that should be drawn from the book of Job, and this is just awful material from my point of view.
Oh, yeah.
It stifles the mind.
Totally. There is a point in the story where Job actually does sort of muster a sense of dignity finally.
Right.
And he says, why are you doing these things to me? And then that's where God just sort of inexplicably goes into this, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?
Exactly,
like you said, you're a worm. You're nothing. You're nothing except through me. I know I haven't answered your question.
And on that last thing you said, Joshua, what better example could Plato have had for his republic and his golden men and his idea of a hierarchical rule of the philosopher kings and so forth than the book of Job, and to illustrate that, well, these ordinary mortals don't understand what these philosopher kings are doing, and they don't need to understand. All they need to do is obey, learn obedience. Do whatever you're told to do by the authorities. Oh my gosh, what a terrible, terrible lesson that comes from the book of Job. Now, Martin, last week you were coming to the defense of the Catholic Church a little bit. Can you come to the defense of the book of Job in any way? Have I misrepresented or mischaracterized? What is your take on the book of Job? Uh-oh. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay.
Am I still here? That sounds like an existential question there.
Martin, you must be on mute. We can't hear you.
I don't see him listed. He may have gotten disconnected. Okay. So hopefully he'll find that. I did want to say on a let's say a more happy note here. Let me try and turn the conversation just a little bit. And I found it interesting that in section 41 there, and I can't believe we're not past section 41 yet, does not allow his past pleasures to slip away, but takes delight in constantly recalling them. And I think that's an important, because that is right out of the letter to Monoikius again, because he has a section in there where he talks about gratitude of that which has happened and that which has taken place. And I find it can be more poetically put there in that from the letter, by means of the grace of memories of past events. And I found it interesting whenever I was doing some research on that Bailey has commentary for that particular line in the letter. And he says, by the grateful recollection of the past, i.e. of the philosophic truths which he learned in earlier life. And I think Bailey is just a little bit too timid and narrowly focused on the philosophic truths. And I think that a lot of people pick up on that. And the ones that I had found, too, that sort of go along with that, in addition to this part in Cicero, is Vatican saying 17 and 19, which are, if you will indulge me very quickly, 17 is not the young man who is most blessed, but the old man who has lived nobly, because being at his very peak, the young man stumbles around as if he were of many minds, but the old man has settled into old age as if in a harbor, secure in his gratitude for the good things he was once unsure of. And the good things there, I think, are obviously pleasure, at least to me. And then 19 is the one who forgets the good things they had yesterday becomes an old man today. And again, I think those good things he's talking about are specifically the pleasures that he's experienced.
That would be a good example why I classify Bailey in my mind as too much of a stoic to care too much for his commentaries, because that's off the beam there.
But it's par for the course, too. I mean, it's like that's sort of the academic perspective that you talked about.
Well, I hope Martin will be back to join us here, but I'm going to stay with the other question for a minute, because even if we don't go too much into much detail on the rest of it, I think this question is important, because for a moment, let's read 42. This being so, it is plain that all right and praiseworthy action has the life of pleasure for its aim. This being so, again, to what truth standard is he appealing so that we're supposed to read about the guy who's got all these things going for him and the guy who's down on his luck and is just in the midst of misery? How do those two examples lead us to the conclusion that all right and praiseworthy action has the life of pleasure for its aim?
I think it goes right back to Epicurus whenever he was talking about him earlier in the work, that Epicurus just said, it's patently obvious through our natural instincts that we go towards pleasure and we try to avoid pain. And he said that that's the basic natural instinct of any living sentient thing.
Yeah, Don, I'm not trying to play a game with these questions. I think that's pretty close to what I'm looking for. I'm thinking that the big issue here is just this issue of whether you want to call it feeling or experience or pleasure and pain or the passions or pathe or whatever word you're going to use to describe the emotional, physical effect that it has on you. To me, he's saying here that you cannot intellectually rationalize yourself to this conclusion. You've got to go with your gut instinct and your gut feeling that tells you that this is the best life, because you can have all sorts of arguments and reasoning about why this is not the best life and why the life of the person who's living in misery is not the worst life at all, but preparing him for eternal glory at the right hand of God. So I think there's an implicit presumption here that overrides everything else, that the Epicureans are looking to this natural faculty of, again, Don, what words do you prefer right now? Feeling, or what would you call pain and pleasure? Sensation. Again, there's so many issues about the shades of meaning between these words.
Yeah.
But I do think there ends up being a bright line between these feeling sensation words versus the logic and rationalization words, and that ultimately you go with your gut, you don't go with your logic and rationalization.
One thing I have to say there, whenever you say about going with your gut, I mean, that's not to say that everybody gets to make up their own fact. Your gut doesn't necessarily tell you that your gut tells you that the world is flat. That doesn't mean the world is flat. That sort of thing.
Correct.
We're not talking about that kind of gut feeling here,
or the moment to moment gut feeling where you're just going to go with the pleasure of the moment.
Right. The Cyrenaic position.
Right. You've got the longer and not only
you've got the faculty of wisdom to help you make decisions that will aim you towards more pleasure.
You've got the bigger picture, and the big picture may be a colloquial way of talking about it, but it's not something that's easily reducible to a formula. If it were easily reducible to a formula, it'd be a lot easier, but it's not.
And that's one of the reasons I always take Epicurean philosophy to be very much about personal responsibility and taking responsibility for your choices and your avoidances and all that sort of thing.
Right. Joshua and Martin, are you back with us?
Yes, so I missed out the last 5 minutes. Apparently there was a internet connection problem here. Both my computer and my smartphone were disconnected.
Welcome back.
That's right. Welcome back.
We've solved the mysteries of the universe. Oh, man, you missed it.
But Martin, we were talking about a lot of different things, and you may have gotten distracted by getting back on, but was anything on your mind that you wanted to say about what you were hearing?
No, not. I was listening attentively, and this one is not really controversial, so it sounds all agreeable.
I agree.
Martin, I would like to get your opinion on this question, though. Maybe you'll have a direct answer, as you often do, and maybe you won't. But I do think it's important to think, as we look at this hypothetical question about the best man's best life and then this terrible life in contrast to it, and think about what it is that he's appealing to. What is the thought process that you're supposed to follow? How does this argument in Torquatus's mind lead to the particular answer? If somebody asks you that question, could you unwind that? Do you see even why I'm asking the question? I think as we were setting it up a little while ago, if you believe in religion, you're going to reject this because you've got a whole different set of priorities. If you believe in virtue, you're going to reject this because you've got a whole different set of priorities. What is your set of priorities that you're supposed to have in order to see this argument as persuasive?
Let me jump in there, Cassius. We'll give Martin some time to readjust to
Yes, since you were out there, yes.
Getting back on the call. Okay, I'm going to keep harping on these two words. I've used them a little bit in this Torquatus section. Normative versus descriptive. Okay, I'm looking at the middle of paragraph 41. He says, "But if a life replete with pains is above all things to be shunned, then assuredly the supreme evil is life accompanied by pain." Okay, when he says that if a life replete with pains is above all things to be shunned, he's not making, I don't think, a normative claim there. He's not making a claim about how people should react to this thought experiment. He's making a claim about how people do react in reality to things like pain and anxiety. We naturally shun these things. And so you don't have to make an argument that they should be shunned. You just dispassionately examine what you're actually doing when these things come up. And so he's got this descriptive analysis of what he thinks the way things are. A life replete with pains is above all things to be shunned. You know, when you see someone suffering miserably, I can't, well, I don't want to say it, nobody, but the great majority of people are not going to envy the position of someone who is profoundly suffering, right? Some people, there's mental health issues and things like, what is it, Munchausen's, where the suffering of someone in the hospital and the attention that they get because of it. But for most normal, healthy people, no one is envying suffering for the sake of suffering. Then he makes the normative claim, the claim about how things should be. Then assuredly the supreme evil is life accompanied by pain. So he's just, like we talked about in the first and maybe second episode, when you look at an infant child or a young animal who's born into the world and looking up at the lights of the sun, as Lucretius says, no one has to tell them how they should react. We just look at how they do react.
Joshua, we need to keep this on a very common sense level so that we can actually help people and accomplish something and not just run down rabbit holes. But what I hear you describing is what is often presented to college students and many others by many philosophers as saying, Joshua, you're wrong. It is impossible to derive the ought from the is. They're saying that what is cannot logically lead you to a conclusion as to what ought to be. Now, I don't think we can go too far down that direction other than to say that's not what Epicurus is doing. He's saying you do derive what ought to be from what is, or at least in a certain sense of the word ought, you do anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You just gave the key right there, a certain sense of the word ought. In philosophy, and I'm going to try not to get too technical here, but this is Hume's guillotine. This idea that you cannot derive an is from an ought. There's no description of how things are that can tell you how they ought to be. This is if you're talking about things like transcendental moral oughts, like a Platonic ideal of what you should do. But what we really engage with, I should say, in the real world is rational oughts. And this line here is an example of a rational ought. If you don't want to be the guy racked with pain and anxiety and mental anguish, and you don't, whether you're willing to acknowledge that or not, most people don't want to be that guy. The rational ought then is to avoid pain and pursue pleasure.
But Joshua, to me, you're still caught and need to take the position that the reason you're confident in maintaining the position you're taking is because you've accepted largely the Epicurean physics and the Epicurean epistemology, and you don't believe that all of this suffering.
I don't think you got to do that. No, I don't think.
Well, but wait a minute. If there's a God who's going to send you to heaven, if you believe there's a God who's going to send you to heaven, then every bit of this pain is worth it. And so, how do you reject the fact that there's a God who's going to protect you in heaven, other than go into the physics of the nature of the way the world works? Now, I know why you're pushing back on that.
Now you're using I think the inculcation and the cultural education and the institutions that have impressed themselves upon people. What Epicurus is doing is going back before you are inculcated with all of the theories and the institutions of church and state and all those sorts of things that get piled on top of you. What he's trying to do is go back before you're infected with all of that and say, this is how people act if they were really honest with themselves, if their minds were not polluted by all of the
incorrect positions. But you're taking the position, aren't you, Don, that those positions are incorrect? You're saying that it's corruption. You're saying that it's perversion, which means it's wrong.
I'm just saying that it gives you a particular frame through which to view life, and what Epicurus is trying to do is step outside the frame, and that's why he points to babies and animals and that sort of thing. They have not been inculcated yet.
Right. I completely agree with you at that point.
Yeah.
Somebody else jump jump in.
Yeah, okay. The idea of like wrong or perverse, those are value judgments.
Right.
What
Right.
what we're really talking about here are.
Well, I didn't mean them as a value judgment. I meant them as incorrect, inconsistent with the truth, not real is the way I meant them, not as value judgments.
Okay.
I'm saying that.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. But the problem here, whether they're, I don't want to say it's not a question of whether they're right or wrong, but I think what Don is saying is whether they're, that all is this architecture of human argument and position that is sort of superimposed on nature. No one wakes up, you're not born and then you start worshiping, Yahweh. Because when you're born, you don't even know. There's no way to grasp, really. And you wouldn't come up with it on your own. If a child was raised in isolation, they're not going to be like, oh, let me sit down and write a book, and the book they happen to produce is the Bible. That's not going to happen. So below all that, before all that, you have a level of, the infant or the animal in nature and in a natural state pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain.
I think it sounds like we're arguing a little bit with each other, and I don't mean to intend to argue with the position you guys are taking, because I would say that I'm completely with you on those points. But you then immediately reach the question, why is Epicurus right and those other guys wrong? Are you're saying that is the way you think and that's all you can say about it? What is the authority or the reason why you consider it to be persuasive to look at the puppy and the kitten and say that's the way that I should live every day of my life?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that question other than what I've given, really.
Martin, can you help us?
Yeah, the thing is, if people make different premises than us, of course they will come to different conclusions. So there's no point to try to persuade a Stoic or a Christian to become an Epicurean, because if they stick to their premises, then it would just not make sense to them to change. So the advantage of putting it all down as you see it, it just shows the consistency of Epicurus' philosophy.
Okay, so why is it that you choose your premises versus the premises of the Platonics or the Christians?
Yeah, I see no indication that there's anything actual behind the Christian idea of a God. Plus, it's even worse, that a religion, and any religion I have looked into so far, any of the larger ones, is more about politics than actually about really belief. So that means a religion has no credibility for me.
Okay, well, that takes us back to the objection that Don raised a few minutes ago. Is that not saying that your premises are mostly aligned with Epicurean physics and epistemology?
Yeah, exactly. So that means I'm aligned with some of the basics there, and then those things which then make sense within that frame, I will easily be convinced of by myself as well.
Right. There's obviously the many caveats that we make about changes that would be required in some of the details and some of the major parts of Epicurean physics. But when it all comes back to the conclusion that nature operates through natural processes and doesn't have any supernatural aspect of it at all, it's pretty hard for me to divorce all of these questions from maybe that central question. Is there any evidence of a supernatural dimension that we should take into consideration as persuasive at all? And Epicurus points to the answer being no. These other guys point to the answer being yes.
But at least Epicurus comes from a position of observation and evidence.
Right. And that's where we share the same orientation. We accept the idea that observation and evidence is the way you should make your decisions. But not everybody accepts that. And the type of observation and evidence that you should consider is the big question as well, because there you go with the issue of religion and divine inspiration and those kind of revelation issues, because if you accept those as adequate evidence, then everything gets turned on its head. So I didn't mean to go too far off into anything that's controversial, because I really don't know that I'm thinking that anything we're saying is, from the Epicurean point of view, particularly controversial. Don.
No, I mean, I think you bring up a good point. It depends what kind of frame and premises and those sorts of things that come up. And Martin said sort of the same thing. But I just keep coming back to the sense that, at least to me, that just seems like such a common sense argument that if you come at it from, a supernatural premise, or you come at it from, a virtue oriented, it just doesn't make sense. I just have a hard time wrapping my brain, and I find I have a real visceral reaction to that religious viewpoint that people may bring to it. And I'm just like, oh, you're just wasting your life.
Joshua, I know you have something to say in response to that.
Well, okay. I think one of the words we're looking for here is falsifiability. That's not a word that's going to really apply in the 3rd and 4th century BC, because they didn't have anything like the scientific method.
Right.
But it's quite easy for us to see how the existence of Yahweh is unfalsifiable. There's no way to even examine that claim, and therefore there's no reason to consider it, really.
That's a logical argument that you're going to have to buy into the logic of in order to find it persuasive, right, Joshua? And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I think both teams have to use every argument at their disposal and have to understand every argument, because that argument is used against Epicureans every day, one way or the other. People are going to say falsifiability is a ridiculous notion. That's the whole issue of the book of Job. God has his own ways. The wisdom of men is trash in the eyes of God, and so forth. So all of your logical arguments, falsifiability or anything else, are out the window to people who take that religious perspective.
I think that falsifiability is at least partially an evidentiary argument.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. There's a logical structure to it, but it's not exclusively logical and theoretical, right?
Yes, I don't know whether I would put it in epistemology or physics or whatever. I guess logic doesn't have a separate designation in the Epicurean categories, but yes, it's what you choose to accept as evidence and how you choose to process the evidence, and I guess that's epistemology. So as we begin to think about the time, section 13 says, now inasmuch as the climax or goal or limit of things good, which the Greeks term telos, is that object which is not a means to the attainment of anything else, while all other things are means to its attainment, we must allow that the climax of things good is to live agreeably. So we've taken this observation of kittens and puppies, we've taken this thought construct of what appeals to us as the best life and what repels us as the worst life, and we've taken that observation and that thought construct, and we've come to this conclusion that these lead us to the conclusion, whether you call it logical or some other type of conclusion, that the end of things good is to live agreeably or pleasantly.
Yeah, this seems to be more or less, I guess, a summation of what he's already said.
Is it a logical summation? Is it
I don't even want
to... What'd you say?
I don't even want to use that word now. No, he's just basically restating it, He
tied a ribbon on that part, and now he's ready to move on.
Tied a ribbon, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is, of course, probably what we ought to do in the interest of time. And so let's go to 13. Those who find the good and virtue alone are dazzled by the glory of her name and fail to perceive what it is that nature craves. And they will be emancipated from heresy of the deepest dye if they will deign to lend ear to Epicurus.
I love that line, dazzled by the glory of her name. That's a good line.
There's a lot of emotion and sarcasm and intensity in this paragraph, it seems to me. For unless your grand and beautiful virtues were productive of pleasure, who could suppose them either to be meritorious or desirable? Well, Plato could, Yahweh could, the Judeo-Christian tradition could.
Well, even in that case, though, I mean, when you look at Yahweh, and I think I've made this argument before, it is fundamentally a kind of hedonism, particularly in Christian theology, where you are making the hedonic calculus to trade pain in this life, temporary transitory pain in this life, for an eternity of pleasure in the life to come.
Oh, that's a good point. I never thought of that way, but yeah, you're right.
There's actually, I think it's Erasmus. There's a medieval writer, theologian, who wrote an essay against Epicurus and basically said the only way to really be an Epicurean is to be a Christian, because when you factor in, an eternity in hell, there's no amount of pleasure in this life that outweighs the pain that you're going to experience in the life to come. So in order to pursue pleasure intelligently, you have to be a Christian, because you have to get the golden ticket into heaven in order for the hedonic calculus to work out in your favor in the long run.
Oh, that's I've never heard of that before, but that is a very clever argument. I'm not saying it sounds good. I'm just saying it's very clever.
Yeah, we're going to have to find out who actually did that. Maybe put it in the show notes.
Well, section 13 is where we begin the transition in this passage to talk about, since virtue is not good in and of itself, it must be productive of pleasure. And he's going to go through a long discussion going through each of the major virtues, how the goal of each virtue really is pleasure. I guess we're still in that same argument to some extent of whether the is translates into an ought or not. But I think, Don, you've had a lot to say about where we go from here on this section 13 and so forth. How would you describe where we're going to begin to go in this passage?
I think this goes back to what I've characterized, and it's certainly not original with me, but characterized as instrumental goods. He's going to talk about the instrumental goods of wisdom and the virtues, and that they are instrumental because they move us towards pleasure, and pleasure is the one that you're aiming for.
The one about navigation is just, there's several just great examples here.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the whole that, you know, the words of the philosopher are empty if they do not result in a life of pleasure or do not have practical benefit.
Well, let me invite a comparison here and talk about that for a minute. I want to look at this particular passage with physician's skill and navigation. He says, just as we regard with favor the physician's skill, not for his art's sake merely, but because we pride sound health, and just as the pilot's art is praised on utilitarian and not on artistic grounds, because it supplies the principles of good navigation, so wisdom, which we must hold to be the art of living, would be no object of desire if it were productive of no advantage, but it is in fact desired because it is to us as an architect that plans and accomplishes pleasure. Okay, now I'm going to read to you a passage from John Adams' letter to his wife, Abigail, that he wrote when he was in Paris in 1780. John Adams was a great admirer of Cicero. I'm sure he probably read the very words we're reading now. He probably read them in Latin.
That sent a little chill down my spine. Ooh.
Yeah. How do you like that? Okay, so he's writing this letter from Paris, and he's been to Paris before, but he never really paid attention to how beautiful certain aspects of Paris was. So he's walking around, and he's like, there's temples and palaces, paintings, sculptures, tapestry, porcelain, etc. He said, if I had time, I would describe the beauty of all of these things to you. But then he says, but I could not do this without neglecting my duty. The science of government, it is my duty to study, more than all other sciences. The art of legislation and administration and negotiation ought to take place, indeed, to exclude in a manner all other arts. I must study, this is the important part, I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography and natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. So what John Adams is saying here is he has an obligation to study certain things, and that it's notable to me that philosophy does not factor into that. Okay, Epicurus would say that, you know, it's essential. You have to study philosophy. You have to study philosophy when you're young. You have to study philosophy when you're old.
Yes.
You cannot defer the study of philosophy, even within your life, much less to defer the study of philosophy to future generations. But John Adams, who is a Ciceronian in a way, is doing exactly that. Granted, you know, he's in a particular historical context when there's a lot of rather important things going on, but he wants to totally defer, or at least say he's deferring the study of philosophy as being not essential. It's not important for him to do that. It's important for him to do this other thing. So my question is, what is it that makes the study of philosophy, from Epicurus' point of view, essential for the individual in this life and at all stages of this life?
I think it's important to remember the actual word philosophy means to love wisdom and to practice wisdom. And I think that's sort of what he describes here is even he describes wisdom as the art of living. So I think it's a more all-encompassing. We think of philosophy, I think, as an academic discipline and that it's, you know, disconnected from the real world. But back in Epicurus' time, it was literally, how do you live your life? What wisdom are you going to bring to the practice of your life? And what direction are you going to point to? And that was what philosophy was back then. And I think that Adams is thinking of philosophy almost as an academic discipline. Whereas if you look at Adams' words there, he's taking pleasure in the idea of providing a better world for his children. And so he's almost, I mean, I would make an argument there that he's almost taking an an Epicurean stance without even realizing it.
Yeah, and he certainly would not have admitted to it.
Exactly.
Unlike Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Adams would not have.
Martin, you have any thought on that?
Robert, I have nothing to add on this one.
I have a feeling that Cicero would rip Adams up one side and down the other for that little illustration you're giving there, because Cicero would have said, I think, that the Roman perspective would have been everybody has to be prepared to fight their own battles all the time. So the idea that he could fight battles and then generations ahead would no longer have to fight any battles, I think that would be foreign to Cicero. So from even a sort of Stoic perspective, I find Adams's analogy to be faulty from that point of view. But that's exactly the perspective I think that you're saying Epicurus would have. Everybody is constantly in need of wisdom, and your circumstances around you are going to change from day to month to year. And there are no absolute formulas like Plato would suggest that there are. There are no books like these religious leaders would insist that there are, that you can just pick up and read and get an answer to a question based on something that happened yesterday, because the things that happen today and tomorrow are going to be new and unique, and you're constantly going to have to apply the principles of thinking, of epistemology, of physics, of ethics, and you have to understand them yourself or you're just going to be lost.
Yeah, definitely. When I was in college, Don kind of touched on this point. Philosophy was like the classic sort of waste of time. Like if you were studying philosophy.
Yes.
What are you doing? What are you even doing? But really, it's the most important thing, because the worst thing I can imagine is getting to the end of your life and then studying philosophy and realizing, oh, I got it all wrong the whole way through. Wouldn't that be a terrible realization? I guess you could make an argument from an Epicurean point of view that, well, now that you've realized that, at least you can live that way now, and going forward. But there is a certain emotion involved there that I'd hate to get to the end and not have even analyzed the problem. And most people don't.
I think it's important too to go back to, because the word wisdom too, I think, has some sort of vaunted connotations. I think for us today, it's like almost capital W wisdom. And I was checking the Latin here that he uses, and of course it's a sapientia, and just the some of the basic definitions that they give in Lewis and Short is good taste, good sense, discernment, discretion, prudence, intelligence, forethought. So all of those things are wrapped up in that one word that he's using there in this section of the work.
Yeah, I think if you run into these situations where you meet someone and they're like, "Oh, how's your day going?" And if I were to reply to that, "Oh, it's been good. I've been pursuing wisdom all morning." Certainly.
Right.
There is the idea in a casual age, like the age we live in, that the pursuit of wisdom, not even to say the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of wisdom, is hopelessly pretentious.
Exactly.
So you have to deal with that problem, engage with the world.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that right there, taking all those sorts of connotations into that wisdom, I think it's interesting that he says, wisdom indeed is alone able to drive sadness from our minds and to prevent us from quaking with fear. And so I think that, having all those connotations of that word it's like, okay, yeah, I can see where you're going.
And where we've been going is where we are now, near the end of this episode of the Lucretius Today podcast. And part of what we need to do in today's closing is to recognize the contributions and to state our appreciation for Don having been involved over the last, I don't know whether
7 months now, I think.
7 months. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was a full year or not, but we really appreciate Don stepping in and helping us finish Lucretius. Almost all of book 6, I think, is what Don was here with us for. And he's now going to take, I'm using the word sabbatical.
Yeah, we're going to do sabbatical.
Sabbatical, which implies that he's going to be back with us, but life does tend to intervene and call people away to other things occasionally than the study of philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom and pleasure. So,
well, that's not to say I'm going to abandon the pursuit of wisdom. Come on, give me a
break. Right. We will expect you to continue to help us along the way on the EpicureanFriends.com forum And
Looking
as
forward
soon
to
as
it.
you're able and ready to come back to any kind of podcasting, we'll be looking forward to your doing that. So I wanted to say that in case I forget it as we begin to close today's episode. Before we go to closing statements, is there anything else? There's a lot that we're skipping over here in the final 5 or 6 sentences, but I think we have hit in what we concluded on today, the real essence of the issue. And then there's 1,000 more details that have to be discussed, but at least we've brought it up in a way that hopefully can help people understand the importance of the issue as they're reading through the Epicurean philosophy and deciding how to pursue it further. Anybody have anything specific? This obviously is the section that contains the natural and necessary division, which is right here in the middle of the wisdom discussion. Of course, this is not the end of our podcast. Even though we won't have Don with us next week, we'll be coming back to continue here in the Torquatus section, and we'll take up where we end today on the discussion of wisdom and move on to the other virtues as well. But again, before we go around the table to see if anybody has anything to close, is there any other specific detail that somebody has on the tip of their tongue they want to say before we go to closing statements?
I keep coming back to the whole idea of the common sense nature of this and the self-evident nature, but I think you've done a good job in sort of keeping our feet to the fire and making us explain what that actually means too. So I think even though I have a visceral reaction to some of the things that we talked about when it comes to religion and that sort of thing, I think it's a good thing to actually be able to verbalize that.
We do have a line here that slightly complicates what we were talking about in that controversial passage early on, where he says, "You are," in parentheses, by the way, "you are now aware what kind of pleasure I mean, so the odium of the term must not shake the foundation of my argument." Are we aware of what kind of pleasure he means?
Right.
Gone through all of that.
I think all of them. I mean, that's the thing. I think that he includes bodily and mental in all of them. So that's the kind of pleasure that he's talking about. He's not talking about just the pleasures of the profligate. So, and I hate that word, but the whole just, eat, drink, and be merry sort of is part of it. But that's not the whole thing, too. He's talking about tranquility and calm and that sort of thing as well. He's including in all of that in whenever he talks about pleasure.
I think, too, what Joshua's going towards is we clearly have in this Torquatus character and in this particular material a person who has some degree of conflict in his own mind about some of Epicurus's teachings. Mm-hmm. He's already introduced at the beginning of the narrative that he believes that a more elaborate explanation of the nature of pleasure, and pleasure being the good, is required than what Epicurus himself gave. So he separated himself out on that particular point. And if I recall correctly, as we go further, even on the issue of friendship and perhaps justice too, I'm not sure if it's friendship or justice or both, but he also again comes back and separates himself and says that there's disagreement even within the Epicurean community about what type of arguments to make about the different positions. So to me, I find that sentence that Joshua has quoted as consistent with that sort of little bit of timidness that Torquatus is taking in this whole presentation here. I'm not sure that Epicurus would have said it quite the same way. I mean, Epicurus in his letter to Menicius does talk about people misrepresenting his views of pleasure and so forth, but I don't know that this parenthetical sentence ends up clarifying anything, just like Joshua said. We have at the beginning, as we talked about last week, there was a section that really kind of gave us sort of a definition of pleasure. It is certainly a complicated business.
A lot of cultural baggage comes along with that term. So.
Yes, a lot of subtleties. All right, Martin, any closing thoughts for today?
No, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Who wants to go first, Joshua or Don?
My closing thought is, Don, thanks for being with us. We'll do our best going forward and look for your return. Other than that, I don't have any particular closing thoughts on the material.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Joshua. I appreciate that. You have been just a wonderful addition to this panel. So I really look forward to being able to be a listener instead of having to worry about being available every Sunday morning here. So this has actually been wonderful. And like I said, I plan to be active on the forum and everything. So I appreciate your ability to let me take a little sabbatical. So this will be a nice little pleasurable respite.
Well, good. And we're looking forward, as I said earlier, to your annotated letter to Menicius. So
fingers crossed. Now, see, now you've made it public now. So now I guess I've done it on the forum too. So now I'm committed.
Yeah. I thought it was public. Yeah.
You're right. I guess I have brought it up. I have brought it up in the forum. So
That's a good reminder that Joshua joined us in part because of Don's imminent need to take his sabbatical. I'm hoping we're going to be able to convince one or more other people to join us in the future as well. We're talking to Charles, who was with us in the past, about him possibly coming back. So hopefully we can have a 4-person panel and expand the discussions in the future as well to other people. And that was going to be the point that I was going to make on my closing argument, is that one of the things about this description of the man who's living the best life possible that always has seemed important to me is the issue that he had confidence that he was going to be able to maintain the state that he was in. And I think a lot of what we're discussing as we talk about these arguments is something that's intended to help us come up with confidence that our positions are not just arbitrary, that it's not just a matter of I have my facts and they have their facts and we're never going to agree on anything. So it's all just a matter of arbitrarily taking a position that has nothing further beyond it than that. If you don't have some degree of confidence in the conclusions that you're reaching, then you're going to necessarily have anxiety and fear that perhaps you're wrong and perhaps you do need to worry about spending an eternity boiling in hell and things like that. So it's a very complicated subject, but one that's important and well worth study. So that's what we're trying to do here. We will continue to try to do it. Best wishes to Don. Hope he'll be back soon, and we will be back again next week. So thanks everybody for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.